be streaming. And let's go to speaker view. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching and joining today's meeting. My name is Elvin Ortiz, and I'm with CraftX. Today, we're talking about Tachyons, and we actually have Simon with us, and he's going to tell us a little bit about Tachyons, share his experience using it. But first, Simon, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Simon. I'm originally from Switzerland, but now living in Sydney, Australia, where I live with my wife and 2 kids. I was originally a sports teacher, so I've got a lot of teaching background, and progressively I moved into web development because I was running a sports website for the school, and I fell in love with CSS, HTML, and started digging that way. After a while, I started doing themes for Theme Forest. I don't know if you know the platform. Okay. And the work I did there eventually got me the job at Society One, which I've been working at for 2.5 years, and which is where we brought the, pardon me, the Tachyons part of things. Regarding Craft CMS, I started working with Drupal a long time ago. That was the first CMS where I got into web development. I didn't know what I was doing, but I could find a module for that, and then slowly started to learn how to tweak the CSS and the HTML and reverse engineered my way into front-end development. After a while, I moved to WordPress because the ecosystem was just fantastic, and I still kind of wasn't sure what I was doing. And as I was getting really good with front-end, I started getting a bit frustrated with the way the templates are built, both in Drupal and WordPress. And I looked for some other things, and I initially found a CMS called Modex. I don't know if you heard of Modex. And that was mind-blowing for me because suddenly my front-end skills, HTML and CSS, could completely translate to a static site that becomes a CMS. I wasn't still completely happy with the CMS because a lot of things sits on a database and the ecosystem is a bit small. And suddenly I discovered Craft, and oh man, I literally haven't looked back since. Craft is exactly the workflow I like to work with. And yeah, so now I've been working for the last 2+ years every day with Craft, and loving it.
That's fantastic, and it's kind of you've been through a long journey, having worked with WordPress and Drupal. A lot of people have very sensitive feelings about those platforms and have gotten burned by, getting heavily invested in them and then kind of hitting some roadblocks.
Been there, done that, yeah.
But how about your personal life? I know you do some surfing. What else can you tell us about something, your passions, things that you enjoy doing? Because to some degree, WordPress and Drupal can get kind of taxing.
Absolutely. So yeah, outside of web development, I'm a very active person. As I told, I was a sports teacher in a previous life, and I always enjoy the outdoors. Living in Sydney is fantastic for that because I get to surf pretty much every morning before I start working. We live about 5 minutes walk from the beach, and while Sydney is a big city and there's some frustration with traffic and things you could find in places like San Francisco, it's being able to walk to the beach any morning is amazing.
Man,
the other I take it for granted sometimes, but now that it's part of my lifestyle, it's difficult to imagine life without this routine. And my other passions are basketball. I always played basketball since I was a kid, and I still do in a rec league. We slowed down a little. I play in a amateur league, let's say. Snowboarding, I did a lot of snowboarding in Switzerland, a bit less in Australia, but we try to go once or twice every year.
Okay.
It's actually not bad. I've been very lucky with the days we chose. Australian Alps actually have some good snow sometimes.
Yeah, that sounds like a great place to go hiking and skateboarding and snowboarding and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I also enjoy music. I always did music when I was a kid, piano and guitar lessons, and now my jam is the ukulele because we moved around quite a bit, and having a big guitar is kind of bulky. We go camping a lot, and my father-in-law kind of got me into playing ukulele because it's such a portable, simple little music instrument. And now pretty much every night I put my kids to sleep playing some music for half an hour, and I'm loving it. It's a nice way to escape and just let your mind relax, and it's also creative, kind of like design and development in another way.
Yeah.
So it's a good balance.
I think that, and especially if you work remotely, because if you work remotely, a lot of the times you are the only person working at your house or your home office or whatever, and you don't really have a ton of people that you interact with on a daily basis, and it's hard to kind of draw inspiration from your four walls around you.
Yeah, that's right. For the last 2 years, I've been working 2 days in the week in the city. Okay. And 3 days from home. But from now on, I'm going to work full time from home. So as you say, it's important to find ways to not just become little computer zombie and not talk to anyone.
Absolutely. Now, I don't mean to put you on this spot, but is there any truth to the rumors that Andrew has been spreading out about you regarding being a Calvin Klein model?
Nothing is true there. I thought that was funny. A lot of that photo, a lot of people think that I was trying in a swimming pool, trying to recreate the Nirvana album cover. And actually, I was just up in the Gold Coast in Australia, and we had these disposable plastic underwater cameras, and we just this photo happened to be really cool, and it kind of looks like it's a swimming pool, but it's actually in the ocean, and there was no planning. It's just
Simon,
I found this photo. I like it.
Tell the truth. That's the 21st shot. Right? 21 tries before you got one.
Yeah, I'll back Andrew up on that one as well. That's definitely true there.
That's Society One's design director, Matt Barron, which I've been working for the last 2 years with. And
nice.
They tend to gang up on me like that.
Exactly. Well, it's good that you brought your friends because you're going to need it, man. We're going to start grilling you soon. Before we move on, the underwear question, you should check out Andrew Welch actually has a website where he models sumo costumes, so that'll be pretty interesting as well. For everybody checking it out, ask for the link. But let's get into Tachyons. I'll start by telling you kind of where I'm at, because one of the things that I've heard from you when talking about Tachyons is that you either love it or you hate it. And I'm in the place where I haven't made up my mind, right? Primarily because I've read some of the stuff that you've written on the matter. I've read the documentation, looked at some code, but actually haven't put it into practice, right? Which is kind of a big step for me to really understand the benefits that a technology, a framework, or a product has. So that's kind of where I sit. And I'm going to let you speak freely about your experience with it and make the case for it. And along the way, I'm going to cut in with some questions. We'll see if we have questions from people watching the live stream or in the room. And we'll see where the conversation goes. But you have the floor to make the case for Tachyons and tell us about your experience.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think I won't go straight into the technical details, but just a quick overview of how and why I ended up discovering Tachyons. So at Society One, the first year where I started joining, we developed, we developed a really, really fast-paced set of pages and templates. We use the BEM methodology, but as you know, BEM is not like a strict, it's more like a concept and a set of rules to follow. And it works great. I love BEM, and I still would use BEM and use it every now and then in places. But one thing that BEM, and I say that in my article, doesn't prevent is the CSS technical depth, where you build a module and you have a page with a grid of Society One sells personal loans. So we had a different loan types in the grid. So you start your BEM component. So this is a loan module, and then you have a loan title and loan __ image, etc. You create your modules, and it looks all nice and very good, and you've got clean CSS. And maybe 3 months later, you've got another similar sort of layout with a grid of something completely different, like blog posts. And you're like, hang on, I've got my loan __ title. Should I slap that on the blog post, but it's a bit weird, or should I create the same component and rename it and then extend the other one? But once extends is always a bit tricky because you kind of forget where things come from. And there's always a little bit of change. Maybe the font size is different on that page, or there's additional metadata. So you start very quickly getting to a point, especially if you have a short deadline where you are, okay, I'll just copy and paste that, and I'll change the names, and for now it's fine, and eventually we'll go and refactor, etc. And a lot of small things like this meant that even if we paid a lot of attention and put a lot of effort into having some scalable modular CSS, over the time, over a year of building stuff rapidly and different landing pages, we ended up with a lot of CSS that kind of doubles up, where we're like, we should really one day go and merge it together and just improve the way this code is running, because we have duplications everywhere.
Now, for those that aren't familiar with BEM or haven't used BEM in the past, it's its goal to kind of build or write CSS in a more component-aware style, or how does BEM set itself apart from what we're doing on day-to-day writing just from scratch CSS?
Okay, so one of the promises of BEM, and if you apply it correctly, it works well, is to remove the nesting and specificity war, because you can put a class to every element and then sub-elements, and then you try to style it without ever adding specificity. Everything has the same specificity of one. So technically, when you write code this way, you're always going to have control over the cascade, so to speak, and the negative side effects of the cascade anyway. And it also forces you to think, when you write HTML, you have to think, okay, this is going to be so BEM stands for block, element, and modifier. So the block is like your module, like the loan. And then an element is the loan title or the loan image. And then you can have modifiers, like if you have pricing tables, and one of the pricing table is like our popular choice, you want to make it stand out, you would have like pricing table -- highlight or primary or something. And the modifier just adds some styling that kind of changes the element without changing the structure of it. And it's mostly a set of guidelines that, if you follow well, works really, really well at scale. And BEM's great. What I would say is it's never going to stop you from making quick decisions and stuffing it up at some point if there is a rush, a deadline, or shortage of staff or stuff like that.
Go with that at least. So how does BEM in similar ways made way for other sort of similar concepts, things like SMAX or scalable CSS and things like that? Are they kind of similar in terms of concept to have some sort of, to reduce the specificity and to improve reusability, or at least organization of your CSS?
Similar and different, I'd say. I might be mistaken, but I think BEM came after SMAX and the other.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But SMAX from Jonathan Snooks, it's more like having different folders in your CSS architecture, and prefix stuff. Is that a layout thing you prefix with L-, or is that a module, or is that a theme? So it's more like a broader. When you go in the CSS, you're like, and I'm trying to tweak the styles in that thing, and it's probably a module, so I'm going to look in that folder, etc.
Okay, I see.
It's a convention for developers to work together and figure out, man, where did he put that thing? It's probably, if you have a set of guides, it's probably going to sit in there.
Okay, that makes sense. I
think BEM takes a different approach, where it doesn't really tell you anything. You can organize your CSS. There's not a boilerplate with like predefined folders. Right. It's just think about your modules and make a module, and then make an element and a modifier, and just style it without going nesting anything, and you should be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that I liked about BEM, because I heard it said that BEM kind of allows you to think how elements relate to one another, what hierarchy they have, and how they differ from each other, so that you can really think about what elements are going to be reusable and which ones are going to require some updating and that sort of stuff. So enter Tachyons. What does Tachyon offer, or what is different about it than BEM or scalable CSS?
I think, at least to me, the key word is CSS technical depth and complexity creep, etc. So let me give you an example. We had constant new landing page to churn out at Society1, and to me, my only window was literally the Christmas holiday. I had 2 weeks where everyone takes holiday. And because I hadn't my set of holidays yet because of contracts, I was like, I'm going to be working during these 2 weeks. No one is going to tell me to change stuff. This is my one shot. I have 2 weeks to think of a good refactoring techniques. So as I said, we looked at Ben, we looked at Bulma, at so many CSS frameworks that kind of promise to make things simple to maintain. And while I loved all of them, and I definitely considered many of them, I kept thinking, the problem is not the framework. The problem is like there's constant change, or we build something one way, and then a decision in the business kind of makes think we have to tweak a lot of things. And then again, there's always going to be technical debt. And I'm happy Matt Barron joined, the person who said hello before, joined the conversation, because he was helping me with the reasoning of what could we use? Could we just use like a simple grid, like Flexbox grid framework, and use nothing and just write our own CSS? We thought of that too. And one day he said, hey, look, I saw that thing called Tachyons. It looks a bit weird, but the article seems interesting. And I looked at it, and honestly, like everyone else, and you can ask...
It got turned off.
You can ask Adam Morse, the creator of Tachyons. I was like, what? No way. Like, I don't want to use that. It looks like completely dumb, and I'm going to have to paste and copy and paste stuff everywhere. That looks like a mess. And I think everyone has that initial reaction, which is unfair because it's kind of biased, because we have so much best practice in mind and years of doing things a certain way. I compare it to when React came up and the guys at Facebook introduced JSX on stage and literally almost got booed off the floor and laughed off. And people are like, what are you doing? It's like 20 years backwards. What is this? And then people let it sink a bit and realize the benefits of it. I'm not saying JSX is the ultimate solution. I know people have opinions on that.
Right.
But it's been proven to be very, very, I can see Andrew going like, what?
No, well, the key thing, the key thing is that I had the same reaction, right? So I had the same reaction as you. And I think that it's kind of expected, or at least a reasonable reaction to something that you're seeing is like, why in the world would I be doing this? Because right away, I know in my case, I started to think about, am I going to have to remember all of this? Am I going to feel dirty after writing all these classes on a single element? Am I going to have, spend more brain cycles and cognitive load and trying to remember all these things? Because you can't really be looking up everything as you're trying to build, right? But there is some sort of method to the madness. And I think that's probably where you're going to get to eventually. So I'm going to let you continue telling us about the case study.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. I guess that was the whole approach to what other things are out there and what you can do and how I got into Tachyons. But when Matt showed me that article, I was like, nah. I literally looked at it for 5 minutes, and I had heard of it on the Shop Talk show with Chris Coyer, and I was like, they were kind of laughing at it too, and I was like, nah, moving on.
Right.
And about a week or 2 weeks later, still because that was my approach to the Christmas holiday break. I had 2 weeks to refactor, and I was like, I need to start this holiday with a plan and just go out. So during the month of December, I was evaluating all these things. And so a week later, I saw this incredible article by Adam Morse, who is one of the person who created Tachyons, where the article, I'll share it. It's called CSS at Scale, or Scalable CSS. And it kind of shows how, through the process of reading CSS of big companies like GitHub or Stripe, or I forgot the ones, you slowly realize, hang on, there is this element that declares float left, or like text align left or something, and then padding bottom 2 rems. And then he started looking how many of these components or declarations say padding bottom 2 rems, and it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And slowly he thought, well, I mean, I could just have like padding bottom equals 2 rems declaration. Maybe the class name could be like PB2 or PB-2 or something like this. And then started using that and realized, wow, this is pretty cool. Every time I want to apply 2 rems padding bottom, I just PB2, and it's a helper class. And I mean, it's not completely new, because things like Bootstrap, if you look at Bootstrap buttons, it is pretty much a utility class. You have a class BTN, and then you have BTN primary, BTN secondary, BTN ghost. And this is everyone loves, every framework has a button component which kind of uses these utility classes. Mm-hmm. And they also will have, not many people use them, but Bootstrap has these like margins and padding helpers. There's a few set of helpers. And most people are like, oh, I shouldn't use them too much. But if I use Bootstrap, I actually use a lot of these. And anyway, after reading that article, I was like, these guys have really thought about it. It's not just like someone who came up with like this, let's try this weird stuff. And I gave it a good think. And for 3 days, I really tried to play in CodePen and think about, okay, now if I use that, this is going to work. But what are the side effects, negative? Like if I have a list of 10 LI elements, I have to put the class on each of the 10 LIs and stuff like this. And very quickly, I realized all of these little problems like copy and paste, I can abstract away if I use a templating language like Twig or React or anything that lets you build reusable HTML. And once that clicked and I played around a bit, I was like, this is it. I don't know how Tachyons work. I don't know how it scales, but this is what I'm going to use for the 2 weeks holiday. And I'm going to try to make a good dent into the refactoring process. And long story short, I thought over 2 weeks, I would have started doing a bunch, maybe a third or 2/3 of the website. And after 10 days, so on January 4th, 10 days after Christmas, I shipped the entire website, finished, completely refactored while being camping on a holiday with my family. And I was like, this is ridiculously speeding up your workflow. And I can tell you happily now that 8 months later, I don't think any technical debt has accumulated. We've built entire new sections on the website. I'll show you in screen sharing without writing any new CSS. We have an entire new blog. We have a marketing landing page called Make It Happen, which is very custom. And we didn't write any CSS. We just used these utility classes. So I think I should just give, because I talk a lot about the experience, but I actually haven't explained how it works. Basically, Tachyons takes the composability to the maximum. Pretty much you have a lot of set of micro helper classes that do just one thing and do it really well, like a single concern class. So you will have a class for anything that is padding bottom or padding vertical, both up and down, padding horizontal. You will have a border radius class, and then it uses these scales in type and in spacing that kind of the initial one is like 2 up, so it goes from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. So it's quite drastic, but you can pick different set of scales that kind of gives you a vertical rhythm and horizontal as well. And because it's by design limiting you to a certain amount of choices in your design when you use these classes, a lot of people will be like, yeah, but it's if I want to push things 2 pixels up, then it sucks. And while you can, one thing that's important to know is you can write normal CSS along with Tachyon. Tachyon is not like, don't talk to anything else, you're now with me and this is how you do things. That's one of the misconceptions. But having this set of rules, you find out eventually that it gives you a consistency and a very, very good vertical rhythm in your design, because anytime you hit one of the scale choices, it's always on the baseline grid pretty much, and it just works pretty good.
The first question that comes to mind is that, in my experience, when you use a lot of utilities to build components up, say you are trying to build a login form, and you have to style the container or at least center it on the page, and then you have fields and buttons. Using a lot of utilities for that, a lot of the times doesn't give you as much control as you get through different breakpoints. So if you have something like, margin left 20 or whatever, you're talking kind of almost like a fixed class. Now, I've seen others where utilities kind of adjust to breakpoints as they grow. So in terms of having like if you have margin between two components or two sections of a page, once you're in mobile view, of course those are going to break down. But as you start to stretch the page, you might want that margin to expand further than just 20 pixels. Does Tachyons handle some of that, or do you kind of handle that on your own?
It handles that really well and very smartly. The way Tachyons is written, is a set of lots of different components. So the margin component would be just one little modules that you can import separately or along with the, and the way it's written is you have the base classes. So MB2 would be like margin bottom scale level 2, which could be like 2 rem, for example.
Okay.
And it's on top of the file. And then you define a set of media queries. You can have 1, 2. There's 3 by default, but you could add 8. You could add hundreds. Like, it's up to you. It's kind of like Bootstrap has like these 3 or 4 media queries.
Yeah.
So they're predefined by choice, and you can in another module you can define the media queries. And then the way the class works is there's prefixes or suffixes for the responsive classes. So the base one applies to mobile. So it's mobile first by design, which is great. And then when you hit the first breakpoint, which would be, I'm not sure actually what size it is, but something like 540 pixels, let's say, or it's in red. So whenever you hit that, you enter the -ns, which is not small. So anything that's not small and bigger is there. And so in the declaration in the module in Tachyons, it'll come lower. So it's going to be the same class, but suffixed with ns. So it'd be MB2-ns. And this, because it's declared under in the style sheet, it just have that more specificity, or like, like CSS will take the last value. And this is why when you do a hack, you put it at the bottom of the file, because like, that'll override the rest. And so it's been designed in a way that overrides itself very smartly. So you've got the mobile class first, which applies to everything. And then if you wanna tweak this in media queries, you're going up to tablets and then desktop. So -ns will be not small and bigger. And then there's a -m for medium. And -l for large. And so the ns applies for both medium and large. So it's like everything up. But then if you want to target the middle one, it's -m, and -l is the large one. I could probably later show you some screen sharing, so it makes much more sense to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be really good to kind of have a visual feedback on all of these items. But you feel comfortable that all of these classes kind of adapt to a layout as you go up.
It was definitely designed in that purpose of doing responsive websites and doing it in a way that kind of gets out of the way, because it forces you to think of the mobile, what it's going to look on mobile first, and then apply the changes as you go up. And just by the way it's written top to bottom, it just overrides just enough to work absolutely perfectly.
Is there any further setup that you want to do before you share with us what you had? Screen share?
No, I've got a few tabs open. I wanted to show you a few things that we built with Society One. I wanted to show you the Tachyons website. Let me I'll probably pull up one of the. So to screen share, I just go share screen, I guess. Yeah. And then I pick my window. Here we go. Just let me know when you can see it.
Yep, we got you.
All right, so this is the Tachyons website. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's built with Tachyons as well. And basically what it tells you, one of the first principles is it's responsive. It's built by design to be responsive. So let's look at the components. We'll look at the documentation and just pick one. So let's pick, what are you going to pick? Let's pick the border radius one, for example. So you can see first the example. So like I was saying, BR0, BR1, 2, 3, it's kind of intuitive. BR for border radius. And then you have this scale. 0 is nothing, 1, 2 goes up. And you have like specific helpers like BR100, which is like, if you want to do like a rounded avatar, and the pin button. And then it shows you actually what the code is. So every component in Tachyons has a little sort of like documentation on top, and it shows you what's a modifier and what are the media queries points. And then if you look at just that, you should actually know this is the base border radius stuff. And then as you go down, you get now this breakpoint not small, which is the -ns that I was saying. So you get the exact same class names where you add -ns. And this will apply to breakpoint and going up.
Perfect.
And then you go down and you get the exact same with the medium -M and then the BR-L. So one thing that is important to understand is it looks like, oh boy, this is, like you said, the cognitive load of a meta language and learning all these things. I can guarantee you, and Matt Barron, who's a designer first, who knows HTML and CSS, but is by no means like a full stack front-end dev who's used to writing code like for years and years and years. He picked it up like very quickly. And anyone who looks at it, it's a matter of an afternoon, maybe the second day and it's not like you have to learn and memorize stuff because it's all using pretty much the first letter of each word, like border, radius, BR, padding is P, margin is M. Like very quickly you get to a point where like, I'm pretty sure if I try this, the chances are I'm gonna hit the right class because the naming convention is so consistent. And so learning the class names is really a non-factor. It's I don't know, it's like an afternoon of like playing with it, and the next day you get a bit more comfortable, and then you're not looking back. You know everything by kind of instinct, if that makes sense.
Very cool. What things have kind of throw you off about the naming convention? Was there anything when you started to kind of work with it and you started to understand how the breakpoints and how the sort of adaptability was designed? Were there any kind of things, or even now, are there still some names that you think could be improved or are not really as sort of intuitive as the rest?
I don't think so. I don't think naming is a problem. It's been thought out really well. And what I think the big problem is, the huge problem and the mental barrier to get into something like Tachyons. And Tachyons is not one of its kind. It is one of its kind. It's not the only one. There's a lot of other frameworks and approaches that use, I'd say you could say it's called atomic CSS or functional CSS, or one that I like that I hear about is utility class CSS. And it's kind of like BEM or SMAX. It's a new mindset where you're like, no, we're not going to let the HTML and like the modules we build name classes, and then CSS has to fit in that mode. So CSS is now dependent of my HTML. I think Adam Wathan from Full Stack Radio wrote really nicely about this. It was more like, it's not a separation of concerns between style and markup. It's a separation of dependencies. So if you write your HTML and then you write semantic classes, you end up having CSS that depends on the HTML. It can't do anything without it. And the HTML depends on CSS. So you're depending both ways. But by writing a set of CSS classes, helper classes that can work anywhere, your HTML is still depending on it, but the CSS becomes independent and reusable. So you can start reusing that CSS somewhere else. Where when you use BEM and SMAX, you're pretty much locked in. There's no way. People say, yeah, but if you do a redesign and a retheming, then you have to go update your class. First of all, yes, if you have to, you can use copy, search, like find, replace with text editors. You've got good tools. But I've never, ever done a redesign where I don't change the HTML. That just doesn't happen. When you do a redesign of the UI, you usually rewrite the HTML anyway.
So unless you do. I got a question for you, Simon, that I think directly relates to this. And you know that my understanding of Tachyons is pretty limited, right? I haven't really done anything with it. But one of the really cool things about CSS is that, let's say I've styled a button, right? Let's say I call it like homepage CTA button or whatever BEM-ish name that I give to it. If the art director then comes back to me and says, "Oh no, we want these buttons to look different." If I'm using a BEM model, I can just go in and I can change that button class, and it's going to change it everywhere in terms of how it's styled. When I'm looking at what Tachyons does, for instance, you've got a class called BR0, which border radius 0, right? You're never going to change that class, right? Because it doesn't make any sense, because that class stands for the border radius of 0. So I guess my question is kind of twofold. One, how does attaching a class called BR0 to a HTML element, how is that any different than just doing an inline style that says style equals border radius 0, right?
I love it.
Because I'm never gonna change the definition of the BR0. So what's the difference? And then my other kind of point or question along this is that what it seems that Tachyons is doing is changing it from, you don't really edit the CSS anymore, you edit the HTML. So it moves where this work gets done, right?
Correct.
But it seems like I'm losing the ability to just magically change the look of a thing in CSS and have it kind of just work. So why don't you see if you can tackle those two, because I'm curious about your response. Why don't we just use inline styles? If we're going to call it something BR0, why am I not just doing style equals border radius 0? Because the CSS definition is never changing. And then if we're never changing our CSS, aren't we losing some of the power of CSS to alter the way things look?
Excellent questions. I'm very glad you asked, because this is one of the major misconceptions about people looking at Tachyons or something similar first, and they're like, why would I not just use inline style? Exactly like you said. They might look similar, but it's completely different. When you put an inline style on an element, it has a specificity of everything. It just overrides absolutely everything. Right. You lose the media queries, you lose the hover states, a lot of things that Tachyon classes bring to the table. Tachyons takes the complete opposite approach, where anything brings the minimum amount of specificity possible. So if you put, and that was my example, I think I wrote that in my blog post. I was like, Tachyons sometimes is the ultimate tool for BAU, or like business as usual, when the client says, oh, you need to quickly change this banner and move it up there, and we have to go live this afternoon, can you do it ASAP? Sometimes as a front-end dev, you might close your eyes and say, oh my God, now that I've moved that thing here, there's too much spacing at the bottom because the background is white and the next section is white too. So that would be better with 0 margin bottom, but I have my CSS structure that applies a section padding at the bottom. I've been known to do it once or twice. Everyone's do it. You're like, I put an inline style, margin bottom 0, done. I can ship it. It works, and I fixed the problem. But now,
fingers when they do that.
Yes, this is a horrible hack, because now if actually on mobile version you needed a padding, you're like, but now my inline styles, that prevents me from doing that. With Tachyons, you add MB0, and it's a class that will apply MB-0. And if you need it just for the large, you go MB0-L, and this will be CSS. You will not have a specificity of 1 million, and you will not lose media queries. It's just applying CSS, and it's completely different. It might look like inline styles, and actually inline styles are a common hack because it's easy to slap an inline style somewhere, and it brings some of this ease of cognitive load. Just apply that there, and it's going to apply this to that specific element and nothing else on the site. I can put my margin bottom 0 there, and I'm not going to break the checkout form on a page that I never look at in another place of the website. So in that sense, I think it's completely different from inline styles, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, because you get the specificity, and then also a point that someone brought up to me is that from a render tree point of view, it's better as well, because once the CSS object model has been built by the browser, it knows what a BR0 is. Whereas if we're just doing inline styles, it's got to read the style for every single element and then kind of process it. But what about the idea of, I've got this website that I built, and my designer has decided to change the way the button looks. And I've got this button HTML with my class. My class is applied on, 20 different pages, embeds all over the place. Now I want to change that. Do I have to do a search and replace through all of my pages to change it, as opposed to just changing the style in one place in my CSS?
Good question. So can you still see the screen?
Yeah.
So yeah, you got these different buttons, and exactly like you said, the way with Tachyons you're gonna style a button is inside the HTML, and you're gonna slap this horrible looking set of classes. I don't think it looks horrible because I know what it does. I can read it. And if you use that and copied and paste that style across your entire site, the answer is yes. If the person say, hey, we need more padding on the buttons and we need to add a drop shadow, you will have to go in each of these buttons and add, maybe change the PV2 here to PV3 so there's a bit more vertical padding. And that sucks. Yes. And that's why I think Tachyons, and that's the way it was built, is with components in mind. And it kind of invites, if not enforces you to pair it with a templating language. You can use Tachyon with plain HTML, and then yes, you're stuck with copy and paste stuff. But if you look for this string of classes and do a search site-wide, chances are you're only going to target these buttons because no one else will have that exact string. And then you can change it fairly quickly with a replace all. But the beauty of Tachyons really shines when you start using with a component or templating language. So because we're in a craft community here, Twig and Tachyons work wonderfully together because typically you can either create a button little partial that you will include everywhere and have like pass its data, like the link, href, and then the button text. Or what I've done with Society One is I created a set of helper classes, and I called it, for example, I called a thing like this, like button or button base, BTN, something, whatever you want.
Wait. So you came up with a BEM name for the Tachyons classes?
Yes, and it's going the full circle. So now what you're gonna say is it looks like I've reinvented the BEM and I've lost the readability of my components. But again, it's like behind the scenes, it looks the same, like inline styles versus helper classes. It's completely different because it's just abstracting a series of class into a little variable name, and then you can reuse that. And that's if you want to protect yourself against theming changes. You create like a set of classes that are your theme-based declarations, and then you use that instead.
So you could potentially, if you're writing SCSS or less or whatever else, any kind of pre-processing CSS like stylus, you could potentially create a theme file with classes that essentially extend the classes that you would otherwise have to put in the HTML. Then you could just use one class, right?
Well, the way I would do it is I would just do like this. I have in Twig, in my very base file, I have an object called combo, which is the combo classes. And then if I want a button, I would go combo that button. Oops. And that's it. And hidden under this combo button, I have all these classes written there. And that's why we use that Society One. So every time I need the primary button, I just put in the class, I pass with Twig combo button, and it's going to set there. And now if you say we need the button to be purple and have uppercase letters, I can go and change it there in one place, and it's updated everywhere. And it kind of solves that problem of theming, because one of the biggest issue with people with Tachyon is that, Andrew, the point you brought here is like, what CSS allows me to give a style to a button and then change it in one place, and it's going to update. So you kind of create a workaround for that. But the beauty of it is that you don't write additional CSS, and it doesn't sound, again, on the first day you look at it, like a viable solution. But the more you think about it, and the more you realize how many times you've been beaten by a little change in the theme that actually applied also to, you had a table, and that table had a button at the button, and it changed the theme, and it broke the table layout and stuff you don't think about. The repercussions of the global CSS, you never ever hit one of these problems when you work with something like utility classes.
I mean, to me, it kind of feels like we're doing the same thing, but we're moving where it is done. In other words, instead of using CSS to do, BEM style stuff, we're using Twig, the templating language, to kind of encapsulate that by lumping in a bunch of the Tachyon styles. So it looks like we're essentially doing the same thing, but we're moving where it happens.
Yes, and think about the workflow improvements. Once you've been working with Tachyons in a while, I think, again, React got so popular because it did something similar. It brought the behavior and the HTML together. So people were like, holy crap, I can write this component and I can make a click toggle stuff without ever leaving the file. And that's when everyone went nuts with the separation of concerns, is done wrong. We do separation of technologies, but the real separation of concern is my focus is this component and I care about the behavior and the looks and everything. So the real concern should be, it should be sitting together, whatever makes that component work. Not HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because it's 3 languages and by history, like we put them in separate files. And again, when you bring the workflow of the CSS styling inside your HTML, you literally never leave your HTML file. And it's incredibly empowering because you look at the design or even the design you have in your mind and you build it in the browser and you never ever leave that file. And once you're comfortable with the classes, you just build stuff at a ridiculous speed. We've been using that at Society One for 1.5 years. And now I'm working on a project which uses traditional CSS at a big, big scale. And I find myself writing, I'm going to start to build a little UI part of the design. And okay, this is a CTA message. So I'm like, oh, now I need to name it. So, okay, I'll call it CTA-message. And then I go in the CSS file and I create a few styles. I save the file. And then I have to wait for the whole SAS to process the whole thing. And then I look in on screen. Okay, it looks like I want. Then I want a title. I have to find a name. So you get stuck with naming conventions all the time. It's very common that naming things is one of the hardest things in software development. And it's true. When you think about it, next time you write a UI, think about how much time you stop the creative process to think, now I need to find a name. And Matt, that's here on video now, we came up with some crazy names, trying to find something that works, and this kind of work for now. And 6 months later, it never makes sense unless you follow the very strict naming convention. And I think that's kind of what Tachyons does with the helper classes. You take away the naming things from your workflow. You take away the switching to the CSS file, scrolling, this is where I want to put it, and binding your styles with your HTML. And then you take away the pre-processing, just compilation time and live reloads, etc. And you end up just working in one file and never quitting that mental focus on your element you're building. And it's really empowering.
What can you show us some code?
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
Sure, go, Matt.
My name's Matt, and I work with Simon at Society One for a couple of years now, and you know what he's saying now about you know, the speed and the ease of use of it. I mean, I'm a designer who codes the very front end only, and you know, for me, it's all just about how things look and how they work at different resolutions. But the one thing that Tachyons has definitely helped with is just prototyping and building things faster. I mean, it's really, really incredibly fast once you get used to it. I mean, you do come up with some ridiculous lines of class names. The ones that Simon had below showing buttons are like the smallest ones I've ever seen, I think. But once you understand how it works,
it almost looks like you could encode an Al Qaeda terrorist message. That's class, right?
Yeah. Once you understand how it works, like I can sit there now and I can look at the line of stuff and I know exactly what it's doing, and it makes it really easy to build modules. The one thing that I sometimes struggle with from a visual point of view is that it's quite brute force. You can set it up however you want to do it, but by default, its scaling is generally going up by, is it half, Simon, each time? Was it 50%?
The default is it doubles up, so it's like a 2-up scale. So it literally doubles. So when you get to 8 RAM, the next step is 16 RAM. So it's like that stuff.
I have a question about exactly this. It's perfect that you actually joined, Matt, because it's perfect when you're able to design on the fly. But what if you are working with designers and a design where everything has to be exactly so and everything is very designed? Then you usually accustomed to like very specific control. White space is just so, etc. Like
I think that's actually that's. I mean, you know, I've been enjoying using Tachyons. I think it's fantastic what it does, and yeah, I have that issue with it sometimes as well. Just it doesn't. I mean, you can set it up to be the exact, but if you're building components that padding has to be exactly like this, and the white space needs to be exactly as designed, it can be a little bit brute force. But I'm no expert in code writing, but what I normally do now when I'm doing smaller sites for people is to write a little bit of custom CSS, use Tachyons for the main things, and write as little custom CSS as I can, or as I need to get what I want. And I find that works quite well. I know I'll try to get stuff to fit with Tachyons, but I don't want to be stuck by its BR3 or sorry, not normally it's more the margins and paddings that kind of get me, and that you have a MA1 and then an MA2, which is double, margin all 2, which is double MA1, and then it goes up. So it's sort of, you get quite often to these parts where you'll, MA3 to 4 is actually quite a big jump. And so I'll quite often write little custom things. And quite often what Simon and I did was add to Tachyons these little half steps if we used them a lot. So we'd have I can't remember what we called them now, MA3 plus, I think it was. So that was sort of
dash plus, yeah. Between steps.
It was kind of halfway between 3 and 4. So you introduce a few more little steps in there.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah, it's I think if you're working with a site that has to be exactly pixel perfect, you have to do a bit of thinking beforehand. But I mean, we managed to get by, and we're such a small team, and there was really only 2 of us. I mean, Andrew was there, but he was just kind of hanging around.
So one, I guess one other. So that kind of answered the question. That kind of answers the question of, how do you handle very specific layouts or designs that are very very specific in terms of the spacing and the white space between elements and the margins and sizing and things like that? And I think a lot of even us as freelancers or even some agencies are moving away from like pixel perfect designing to a more, especially with responsive design, where I mean, you're going to go through a lot of trouble to guarantee pixel perfection as you go through different stages. But it does raise the point that, you're going to run into these issues where you wish there was like a half step between, like this breakpoint and that one, or maybe a quarter sometimes. And that's good to be aware of. How does, when you're trying to integrate things like, I don't like to use them, but a lot of websites or landing pages will require you to put in a slider or some video thing. Have you guys run into any issues where Tachyons becomes overly verbose or just not specific enough to be able to override some of the stuff that you need to integrate with, whether it's a third-party slider or something like that?
Can I take that one? So
I'll
yeah. So just to bounce back on what Matt said, when you start a project and everyone asks the same questions about specific design, pixel perfect stuff, typically when you start a Tachyons project, you don't just add the CDN file and this is what I got to work with and work with you. You start by defining your scales, your type scales, your spacing scales. If you need to add some increments, you add them at the start. So you look at the design and you're like, oh, this looks like it's going to be a different scale, more progressive, and you set up the scales and you set up your colors as well. What I would recommend is to add colors like primary, secondary, highlight stuff instead of just using green or blue, because then it makes a more like you start with tools that can do literally 80 to 90% of the way of any website, literally. And that's the very important part to integrate and understand is you're not prevented from writing custom CSS. A lot of people use Tachyons and then write BEM modules where they need something very fine. The pages I was scrolling through while Matt was talking, I don't know if you looked, but all of this came after the refactor, and all of this got written pretty much without adding any CSS. If you look at here, there's that custom shadow. It's not a base Tachyon shadow, and the hover state, stuff like this with the drop shadow, it's custom CSS we added on top. But as Matt was saying, we always try to write the CSS in a way that it extends Tachyons. Like, could it be a helper, and could it be like have different use case and have responsive -ns-l properties? And because Tachyons is so zero specificity, Actually, it's just like, I think the level is 10, but everything is at 10. So whatever you write, most of the time, or if not all the time, will overwrite Tachyons. So Tachyons kind of helps you build the core structure to a point where you're like, I'm happy with this layout. And then you can take the fine tuning with your custom CSS. And it's always going to overwrite Tachyons, because Tachyons will never slap an important or like a nested element specificity. So anything you want to style on top, it's always going to win straight away. So you write any additional CSS you write overwrites Tachyons, and that's the beauty of it. It's just.
So let me ask you one follow-up question then. You were talking about starting a new Tachyons project and not, linking to the CDN automatically, but making some sort of modifications to what Tachyons is going to give you. Were you referring to doing this at the CSS or SCSS level, or by sort of bringing in some theme afterwards, or what were you referring to when you were talking about your color variables and things like that?
So the main Tachyons package actually uses post CSS, okay. And you have there's a build, like there's a little video that explains the whole tooling, but you can use you can just grab the minified version if that's what you need. And in the case of Society 1, we use the Tachyons SAS package, which is like a SCSS. If you don't want to have to deal with like post CSS and the whole build tool. And you already have SAS working in your project, so we use Tachyons SAS. And then one of the files is gonna be the colors or the skins, I think it's called.
Okay.
So you get this. There you go. That's the base colors they have, and I think you can do. There's a good amount, and there's a lot of chances you're never gonna use all these colors. So what you would do is customize that file in SAS or whatever tool you choose to use. It goes forever. I'm trying to find the code at the end. And yeah, there it is. So that's all the colors. So what you would do is change, just delete all you don't use and like create your color scheme via these names. And just keep a few, like I usually keep these grayscale ones because they're very useful for borders and stuff. All the grayscale, I would keep them, but I would probably remove. Like most projects, you're not gonna use like light pink, hot pink, dark purple. Like unless it's your color scheme, you customize that template, and then you can use these colors across all the different modules, like border color, background color, text color, etc. So that's what I mean. Spend some time tweaking the color scheme and the type scale, and then start working, and then you will know when you get to a point where you need to write custom CSS. Like I said, Matt's a very talented designer, and when I started saying, hey, we're gonna build with Tachyons, first he was like, but I wanna be able to tweak a bit, and we find a really nice medium where Matt coded by himself all this new block page, and it's using Tachyons, and it was completely built after the refactor. So he might have written a few little more helpers, but most of it is using Tachyons. And if I look at the image, I can know there's a border radius 3 on the image. There's the little hover effect we put. I know the background color, the text color. I know the spacing. That I can look at it and recode it pretty much in like half an hour, very, very precisely, I'd say.
So, Simon, it looks to me kind of like, just from an outsider looking in, it looks like a stenographer looked at all of the various CSS properties and came up with shorthand for the most common ones that they're using. That, hey, we're gonna take the most common CSS styles that could be applied, and we're gonna turn them into shorthand classes that we can then just kind of type out. Is that a fair kind of characterization of what it is?
I think it's exactly what it is.
Okay. Like, I do have a follow-up question to that too.
Yeah, so a lot of people that start using helper classes for margins and paddings, and actually when I started the refactoring of Tachyons, initially that was my approach. I was like, I'm gonna deal with all the spacing between each element. I'm gonna kill all the vertical spacing in my Ben, and I'm gonna put it with Tachyon helpers because it always changes. And I was like, man, that works really well. And progressively, like, I could use font sizes, and maybe I could use background colors and stuff. And sooner than you realize this just works really well. So why not try to find all the common, exactly like you said, Andrew, the common patterns that I keep repeating myself and abstract it in the class. And that's exactly what Tachyons is a set of stuff you find yourself doing repeatedly. And instead of declaring in the CSS everywhere, because again, if you do a theming change, you're going to have to update all of these, even if they're in your CSS, if your vertical scale changes. But now you abstract it, and the HTML kind of controls that that workflow. And whenever you hit something that you like, that would be handy, you add this helper class, and then you start integrating it in your workflow.
So inline style macros.
With that, yeah, but kind of without the actual, yeah.
So let's.
If I could just real quick, a follow-up question that I don't know the answer to, and I don't know that that Simon will know the answer to either, but I'm just kind of curious about it from a performance perspective, Simon. This scares me a little bit because I know the way that the browser render tree works and the CSS object model. And basically, if you end up having HTML elements that have a ton of classes separate applied to them, you're going to end up with a very, very broad render tree. And I wonder if there have been any performance timings of using something like Tachyons versus the BEM style equivalent of the same thing, because the way browsers work, once they figure out what the BEM style solid rectangle button is, that's a leaf in the render tree, right? But when it's looking at an element and it's got BR0, blah blah blah, all of these classes, it ends up making a much more complicated render tree. Have there been any kind of performance timings in terms of what adding all of these classes does to it?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and I strongly invite you to speak to some of the people behind Tachyons. A lot of research have been done, and actually I honestly think that the outcome was it is more performant. I don't know, it's because it's repetitive class and it can be gzipped. I didn't look into it enough. But
well, performant in terms of what? Performant in terms of how it
rendering,
or in terms of the render tree?
The rendering and just like the page speed and the sort of stuff that you. So for those who don't know, Andrew Welch is a very proficient and strong on page speed and performance. He's done a ton of work to optimize page speed. So that would be very interesting. Then you and Adam and the other people behind Tachyons have a chat, because there's definitely a component of that's the principles of Tachyons, and one of them was like code should be optimized for performance. And we're talking about speed here. We're not talking about performance as in conversion rates and marketing performance and stuff.
Right.
So I am fairly confident that I don't know the results of the study, but I am absolutely sure that studies has been conducted. And I remember reading Adam in one of the posts saying, this is when I realized that it actually performed better than I was like, this is it. I'm going all out with this because it just works.
I would love to see that.
Yeah. So
yeah,
Andrew, may I say one thing?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Wolfram, I run a small design studio in Munich, and I'm also like Simon using Tachyons since 3 or 4 projects. And I think, Andrew, what you have to keep in mind is if you have a fairly large project with traditional SAS and BEM way of approaching things, your CSS will grow, whereas the Tachyons stays at its size because you have all the elements and you combine the same elements over and over. And that's a large project makes a redundant code.
That might make the difference. That might be why it's more performant, because every time the pages load, even if the CSS is cached, the browser rebuilds the CSS object model. So the fact that there is less CSS there to parse, that might be the reason. That actually makes a whole lot of sense.
And I think it also speaks to the fact that I think this is what Simon was talking about when he was saying technical debt or code debt or CSS debt, is because in a Tachyons project, you're not going to be writing a lot of custom CSS, whereas if you use something like BEM, well, most of it is going to be written from scratch. So I think we're past the hour here in terms of the broadcast, but I wanted to have the opportunity Simon to talk to you about what are some of the common, you talked about some of the misconceptions from talking to people or people asking you about tachyons. But I also want to know about advice that you may have for people that are currently writing CSS from scratch, for whom code depth, specificity is going to be important, but also talk and give advice to people that are in the other sort of side of the spectrum, people that are using Bootstrap or Foundation. Can you take a little bit of time to kind of give us some final thoughts on that?
Sure. One of the common misconceptions is people compare Tachyons to Bootstrap or Foundation. They're like, which one should I pick? Which framework? And to me, Tachyons is not a framework. It's more like a set of helpers. You can use Bootstrap without really knowing CSS because there's all these modules. And to an extent, you could use Tachyons and grab the components. Some of them look really, really good actually, and you could grab, you want a page that looks like this, fine, you just copy and paste that, and because there's HTML and CSS, it'll work. Like you will have this exact layout in your site. So you could, but you cannot write custom tachyons, use custom tachyon classes without knowing CSS, because it's kind of mapping the CSS spec on like a 1-1 relationship. So if you don't know what floats or flexbox or padding, or if you don't understand the margin collapse and all these things, you're going to hit the same problems with Tachyons. Tachyons doesn't give you a class that you like, this is a button and boom, you have your button. You have to think, my button looks pink and it's rounded corners and the padding is this, and then you compose it. You put the padding, you put the rounded corners, etc. So it's a very different approach. So first of all, I'd say Tachyons is not for people who don't know CSS. You need to know CSS to make the best use of it, unless you want to use that. But what Andrew and Wolfram mentioned is very true. When I started the refactoring of Society 1, the CSS was at almost 400 kilobytes. And I think when I finished the CSS with Tachyons, so that's unzipped, and it's just like the raw values, I was at 147, so divided almost by 3. And I've checked today or yesterday, and I think it gained 3 kilobytes in 9 months of, and I showed you the whole blog, the whole Make It Happen page, the whole blog, all this, writing custom styles additional added 3 kilobytes over 9 months. So you literally have your CSS and it doesn't scale. And the Society 1 site itself scaled up to like brand new sections of the site without writing your CSS. So I think that's one of the benefits.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. I'd say the major misconception is not all or nothing. Like we covered that already. You use Tachyons for what it does, what it helps for, and then you write custom CSS. A great example of that is Font Awesome. So their site looks really, really, really nice, and it's got lots of animation. And like if you talk to designers, like, hang on, this looks like a complete. Who would know that Tachyons is behind the scenes there? It's like there's a lot of custom stuff, and if you look at if you inspect elements, it is a perfect combination of Tachyons and then custom CSS where needed. So I don't know if you see, I'll make it a bit bigger, but so you can see a lot of these Tachyons classes, but then there's a lot of places where the developers have added, this looks like almost all Tachyons, but they added the helpers, but places where you have stuff that you couldn't do, like this background, there's probably a specific class that adds background image icon showcase and stuff like that. So you just extend the Tachyons and write your custom CSS. And Font Awesome is a wonderful looking site, and it's got this consistency, and I'm pretty sure it's easy to maintain because the main part of the whole layout and design is handled by Tachyons.
I guess that also means that since you made that differentiation between Tachyons and something like like Bootstrap. People, I guess for us that we're looking to explore, we shouldn't expect to be able to scaffold like we do with Bootstrap and have prototypes up and running with navigation bars and like side panels or anything like that, right? It's going to be more of a hands-on approach.
Yeah, so with Tachyons, either you use the component library, which has a lot of stuff like navigations and forms, and but then you can see it's / components, and if I go in where's nav? If I go in nav here, I'll have lots of different navigations, and most of them are like responsive, like they've been designed to work kind of everywhere. And then you just grab that, and that's your component. So you can build a pretty good looking Tachyons website without writing any stuff. But again, do you want to have a website that looks like the generic Tachyon modules? They look nice, but I think the power of Tachyons is it doesn't enforce any styles.
Right.
With a trained eye, you kind of pick up if a site was built with Bootstrap or Foundation very quickly, unless it's been heavily customized. But you're like, I know this is the Jumbotron thing from Bootstrap and the black nav bar. Where Tachyons doesn't come up with a specific style. It's just because you're using helper classes, people build all sorts of stuff. And if you look at the sites built with Tachyons, there's a lot of different styles, and very often I feel like there's an effort on typography and scale, because I know Adam Morse, the creator, is very big. He's a designer first, and he's very big on type, and like you can see most of these sites seemingly having a really, really nice typography, like something like that.
Yeah, they do look really nice.
That's very custom, and you're like, hang on, this is. You can't tell it's Tachyons. I showed you Font Awesome before.
So So here's the thing, though. It's like I'm probably in the minority here, but I don't really trust things unless I know there's something that's not great or perfect about them. So what can you tell me about Tachyons that it's kind of annoying or something that you've had to work around?
Okay, the main one I'd say is like Matt Barron was saying, is the vertical scales. And I think, again, it's an implementation problem where we didn't spend enough time at the start setting up the scales, because I just built it by myself without really knowing Tachyons, and then it was done. And now you're like, if we tweak the vertical space scale, it might like break stuff everywhere. So the other common thing we hear is, I'm stuck with my 3 breakpoints. Like, people want to have custom breakpoints, but again, Bootstrap and Foundation is the same. You have your breakpoints, and either you define them first, or you can write custom. I think there is still places where if you work with HTML only, it becomes a bit frustrating to have to copy and paste. Or if you don't, let's say you don't abstract to components in Twig. Society 1 is full of places where I copied and pasted the classes, because I was like, I don't have time to abstract it now. So sometimes you're like, I'm not sure if it actually looks the same or it's a bit different. But again, it's an implementation problem. If you take the time to set it up, I think it's kind of bulletproof, which is nice. It's performant. It scales really well. It's super easy to reason about any parts of the UI. It doesn't overwrite stuff in parts you're not expecting to, and you never leave the HTML file. So you get this incredible workflow. And if there are trade-offs, if there are negative aspects, the positive way take over for me personally.
Okay, well, I think that you've made a really good case for Tachyons, and I can tell you that personally, I am going to try to bring it into my next personal project. And before we leave, there are a couple of questions in our chat that I want to run by you. The first one is, I think someone was asking to see some irregular layouts that you could show, but I think you've done that. Were there others that you wanted to show us? Because people were not looking at your screen the whole time. I was kind of going back and forth between broadcasting your camera and the desktop. So if there are some other showcases, yep.
Yeah, this one is a great example how it's using like margins and maximum width and stuff. And I don't think it's got a lot of custom CSS. It's pretty much all Tachyons. This is all 100% Tachyon classes everywhere. And it's yeah. So to me, it's yeah, that's a good example of if you want like very designy. And I built this website again. I built it in a weekend. It's a craft CMS and Tachyon site that I built. It's my wife actually doing athletics classes, and it's my wife, so it's a free project. There's no budget, there's no time, and so I built it in a weekend, and it's 100% using Tachyons. And like, if just this layout, there's nothing particular, but if you were gonna build that with them, you'd be, this is my intro header component and the intro header, and then you'd have like the intro paragraph and stuff like this. And if we look at this is the code for it. So there's my H1 tag, and you can see it's wrapped in a max width 6 that becomes max width 7 in at large scale.
Where are you looking at that?
So that's I'll actually show you straight into I'll put the dev tools. But this section is wrapped into a MW7, which is max width 7.
Mm-hmm.
That's the scale. And then this next part is a MW6.
Okay.
So it just creates this nice little offset background. And I didn't have to think, how am I going to name that? How am I going to name the next one? And then because it was a quick project, I reproduced that on many different pages. If we go on the team page, I reproduced that offset here again on many pages, and I could have abstracted it to a different components, but because this is a quick project, I just use copy and paste. And I mean, if you look at the template, it'd be great to abstract that to a class, but I can just grab this and reuse in another template, and it just works really well. And the site is super performant. There's little CSS because I cut off some of the modules I wasn't using. And even something like these cards component, they're really cool and they're pretty custom. But if I look at them, I know there's going to be a BL for border left, and then there's going to be a BW for border width, which is 2 or 3 because it's kind of thick. And then the B -- color is going to be my secondary or primary. And if I inspect that, chances are this is exactly what I just said. So
yeah, Simon, I can definitely see that if you know Tachyons and you know the vocabulary that Tachyons provides, if you then sit down to work on someone else's Tachyon site, you're going to be able to hit the ground running, right? Yeah. Because you're gonna know what everything means, and it's going to make a whole lot of sense. And the amount of CSS that's in custom classes is going to be very small. And I can definitely see there being a huge advantage as opposed to sitting down with a large website built with BEM style stuff, because every single website that you go to, someone just invented their own vocabulary for the BEM styling. And before you can do anything, and you can think of it as communication, before you can know enough to be able to work on the website, you have to learn the vocabulary that person decided to use for that site. So I can definitely see approaching a new project that used Tachyons would be way easier than a project that it just has some arbitrary invented terminology that you got to learn before you can do anything.
Yeah, invented by one person for a specific context, and it's very
worse, invented by several people.
I would say it's even true for your own projects, because if you have a break for 2 or 3 months, then you come back and say, "Oh my God, what did I do?" This is the same with my projects now. If I have to update them or make modifications, I come back to them and I have to spend time and invest in all the terminology and naming conventions. And with every BEM project, you say, okay, this time it's going to be perfect. This time it's going to be better. This time it's going to be no confusion. And it always ends up the same. And here you just open it up, and no matter if you just had a lunch break or a break for 2 or 3 months, you just come back and you start working.
Right.
15 minutes makes sense.
That's a huge
hour to get mindset and look at things. Just go and work.
That's a huge compliment, and I think it goes to the self-documenting part of Tachyons, because I've talked to a couple of people that they share the similar sentiment, is that, you know, there is no additional documentation or explanation because the code itself is telling you what it's doing if you understand the vocabulary. Yeah. So that's
just
really
look
cool.
Just look at that for 30 seconds. I commented out all the classes. So you look at this little broken little module, and we're gonna just break it down. I want it to be width, full width, so W width 100, boom. Then I want it to have a background that's near white, almost white, boom. I want padding vertical inside it, here we go. I want padding right, padding left a bit bigger because there's gonna be my border, here we go. I would like a border left with a width of 3, and I would like it to be my brand color, boom. And let's add some border radiuses here, level 2, boom. And it needs some margin bottom, so it's not touching the other one, margin right, and done. And that's how you build anything. And this is a pretty custom, like if I have to write a BEM module for that, it's gonna take me half an hour, maybe an hour to think of it properly. Yeah. And with Tachyons, I built it in like pretty much like I've done now. Instead of checking the box, I typed it, and I literally did it in like 4 or 5 minutes. It's ridiculous. And I use that across all the, if you go in locations, now there's the name of this module is similar, but it removes the location name. And if I go by coach, it's gonna remove the coach, so there's no redundancy, but it's gonna still have, and it's a twig partial that looks like hell, kinda, because, sorry. It looks like hell because that was a side project, and I didn't want to spend too much time. But if I go in partials and I look for my, I'm sorry, I should do that. Anyway, yeah, you look at the twig file, and it kind of looks confusing.
Wait, I think this may have happened a couple of times where you were pointing to code and you were only sharing a program, not your desktop. I think that's what. I think that's what's happening here. Can you share and reshare to see if we can actually see your desktop and be able to look at the code as you were pointing out? I should have noticed that earlier.
Okay. Yeah. So because I'm sharing the one window of the Chrome. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think, because now I've closed the page. I don't think I can show you just yet. But what I meant is there's one twig partial which is called. It's called like a session card. Sure. And then it's got a lot of like a conditional, like if I'm actually using the URL parameter here. Okay. So if the param is coach, then you remove the coach name and you add the location and stuff like this. And then it's one module with Tachyon classes, and I use that module on the entire website, and it works wonderfully. Okay. And I know that it would be much, like if I did that in BEM, it would look the same, maybe even a bit more fine-tuned. But then 3 months from now, like Wolfram said, I'd go back and be like, oh my God, what was I thinking? Or why did I name that thing like this? I don't know. And now I can jump in and just like in 6 months or a year, I can just tweak it. And I don't think I'll ever forget the Tachyon classes, even if I stop for a year, or it'll take me 20 minutes to get back into it. And I could technically copy that and bring it to another website, kind of like a real component that's self-contained with styles. And I could paste that, and it would look exactly like this. Awesome. Which is another.
I think we're about an hour and 20 minutes here, and I just wanted to ask a couple more questions before we call it. Are there any browser support concerns with Tachyons?
Well, with Tachyons, you write CSS pretty much your own way, so it depends what you're trying to do. If you start nesting flex properties like really deep, some browsers don't really like this, so then it's gonna be an issue, but it's your fault pretty much. Tachyons tries to declare basic CSS properties that kind of work everywhere. Okay. I'm not aware, like I'm not sure what's the view on Tachyons, like if it's say we don't care about IE6 because we use some stuff like some properties we know are gonna break there. But I think it's more your implementation of it. You have to use it wisely. I've spoken about quite a few points. There's a few links at the bottom here. I'll share this document with you, which kind of this first article is the CSS scalability that I said at the start of the discussion, where Adam realized that this declaration float left was declared everywhere and started breaking it down and realizing how building tachyons help all of this. And I invite you, especially in the order they're written, it's kind of how tachyons is different from inline styles. It's a discussion on GitHub that covers pretty much what Andrew talked about. This Kiss My Class Name thing is very, very good to see the whole vivid like love or hate about tachyons. People hate it because it's not semantic and stuff like this. And then someone comes up with, hey, did you read that Nicholas Gallagher post about CSS class don't need to be semantic. They're actually just useful for developers. What needs to be semantic is your HTML and the attributes you put with the CSS class is just a hook for JavaScript and CSS. And there's my rewrite here, the story, and Adam Wathan from Full Stack Radio recently, like 2 weeks ago, posted an excellent post. And if you read these in the order, I think there's a chance you might be sold on like, okay, this is not for every project, but this is a very compelling solution.
I think I'm right there right now, to be honest with you.
So I don't know if you want to put that in the show notes or if I share it.
Yeah. I think we can do both. There's nothing wrong with like sharing it. I can definitely update and add it to the show notes there so we can have it and then share it with the craft community as well. There was one final question. I don't know if let's see. Over time, you've been working with Tachyons. Have you altered the way you write your class definitions? Ordering styles alphabetically, grouping class names by media query, using multiple lines to improve readability, etc.
This is a good question because since I use Tachyons, I don't do any of that pretty much.
You just throw it in there.
I literally don't write CSS. Or if I write CSS, it's a single property declaration. It's gonna be spacing or shadow or hover state, and the whole naming alphabetically or by concern. You never really do that because you write single purpose classes. But if I do write BEM, my personal thing is the thing that affects the layout most, like position, absolute or like relative and stuff, I put first. Whatever's gonna stuff up things completely, I put at the top, and then margin and spacing, all that. And then stuff like colors and shadows and stuff that don't really matter for layouts comes later. So when you read your CSS, immediately look at the top for the most important stuff that might be the reason you're breaking.
What about when setting your classes in the actual HTML element? When you're using like MB whatever, like BR0 in the actual element itself, do you do any kind of like ordering, or is that more of the for the OCD inclined?
No, I think it's important, and I don't always follow it, but my rule is exactly the same. And now I understand the question. My rule is exactly what I've defined with the most important layout altering properties first.
Okay.
So I would definitely, if I have display block or display inline block or flex, I'd put that first for sure. And then I'd put margins and paddings, and usually the colors and hover states come at the end. So when you read a line of HTML, you immediately have like the first. It's kind of like critical rendering, in like you want the page to load as fast and bring information to the customer as quickly as possible. I do that for the other developers, where you get to see immediately what it's about, and then who cares if it's blue or purple? That comes later.
Sure. Okay. Absolutely. I think that's all the questions that we have and all the time that we have. I'm gonna do my best to try to get to export the chat script so that we can post that on the site and then share some of your notes as soon as I can. But with that, I just wanted to give you a chance to say goodbye to the Craft CMS community with any final thoughts.
I have a final tip for everyone. There's a tool called cssstats.com, and you paste your website URL, and it just gives you a snapshot of your CSS, how many different font sizes declaration you have, how many colors, how many different spacing you have, and it's usually very eye-opening. And there's also a graph that shows you the specificity walk, and it usually looks like a New York skyline on a traditional site. And when you write with Tachyons, it looks like a truck, like a big rectangle like this. And maybe if you wrote some specific CSS, there's a few spikes, but it gives you a very good insight. And if you go at the bottom of this cssstats.com, there's 3 people that kind of are very active in the Tachyons and the functional CSS land. And these 3 people I really suggest you follow on Twitter and engage with, because they come up with like incredible stuff. This CSS stats is an example. Now that another approach of doing CSS, we're not going to talk about it today, but it's like CSS in JS with stuff like style components, and they're bringing stuff like Tachyons in there. It's incredibly progressive, and they're very clever and interesting people. And look at what they're doing, and it gives you a good overview. And also just know that Tachyons is not the only solution. If you want something more minimal that doesn't care about colors and shadows and stuff, there's one called Bass CSS, which is by one of these 3 people I just mentioned. And it's more minimal. It's literally just margin padding. So if your jam is just to handle the vertical space and layouts with the helper classes, this might be a better option. And I know Adam Morse, the creator of Tachyons, very often invites people to check that out too. It's not like, no, use Tachyons because I built it. It's very... Tachyons is more for designers that want to have colors and hover states and stuff like this.
Sure.
And there's other options that are much more minimal. There's a lot of stuff in the ecosystem, and I invite you to check that out. Not just think Tachyons is the one-off solution created by one mind. That would be my tip.
Fantastic. Okay, where can people find you online?
I am Simon Swiss on absolutely everything. On Twitter, GitHub, CodePen, Slack, anything I join, Simon Swiss. As we discussed offline before the live stream, when my family name is a Greek name, Vrashliotis, and it's pretty complicated. And about 15 years ago, I traveled around Europe, and I wanted to, that was the start of email addresses. There was no Facebook, no like easy connection. And I was like, man, if I have an email with Vrashliotis, no one will ever remember. Like if I meet someone at the pub and I give my name, it's like, and I was like, I'm Simon, I'm Swiss. Let's go with simonswiss@gmail.com or Hotmail. And it stuck. And ever since, people say, oh, this is so easy to remember. So my website is simonswiss.com. Everything, my handle is Simon Swiss at pretty much any social network I'm in.
Fantastic.
So that's the best way to find me up.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I think that you really got me excited about Tachyons, and I really feel like I'll be introducing it into the next project, because I really want to find out what it is that I'm going to gain from it, and you've actually made a really good case for it. So thank you so much for that, and hopefully we can have you back to talk a little bit more about the component-based designs that I know you've been doing. So thank you so much for coming and for this awesome case that you've made for Tachyons.
My pleasure. Really happy to have the chance to do that.
Awesome. All right.